Welcome to Writing the Wrong Way, where we talk about how writing works, how writers work, and how the best writers risk being strange. And my guest today is Erin Moure, a wonderful poet, translator, and creator of so many things. Erin is the Jake McDonald Writer-in-Residence at the University of Winnipeg at the current time when we were talking here, and she was kind enough to come to my class, answer some of the student questions that I had, prepared in front of me, and even take a wonderful question from a student live in the class. And so, without further ado, let's just dive right in to talking to Erin Moure. Erin Moure is here because of she is the writer-in-residence at the Jake McDonald Writer-in-Residence at the University of Winnipeg. So we're really pleased to have her, and really, thrilled the University of Winnipeg's made this possible. And Erin, I just wanted to kind of start with talking to you about because this class, the students have read your prank poem sequence that you co-wrote. That's right. In the Why Poetry Sucks anthology that me and Ryan did. I think like a good place to just sort of start with, sort of who you are and what you do and why you do it, is to kind of look at where maybe your translation practice and your writing practice overlap. Because I find I'm a big fan of your work, but also really enthralled by your translation approach. So I was curious if you could talk a bit more about like kind of where those two things overlap for you, because I know they do very much overlap.
Well, I mean, I think that translating poetry, I speak 3 languages, and because of the ones I speak, I understand 2 others. So I think it's kind of part of my practice to read. I mean, a big part of any poet's practice is reading. And I read in 3 languages regularly, and in my other 2, I can also read. I read in English, in French, and in Galician, Gallego, and I can read in Spanish and Portuguese. I can actually read in Italian and a bit in Romanian and Catalan, but as well, but more slowly. So I'm. If you're going to be a poet and you speak more than 1 language, you aren't just going to read poetry in English. You're going to read poetry in all your languages, because it's all language to me. It's not different languages, it's just language. And so to me, part of my practice and almost responsibility, the fabric of poetry, is to, when there's works that I like, that I think could contribute something to poetics in English, that I try to translate, I try to bring that to people. And as well, in doing so, it's very fulfilling. I get to live inside other people's poems, and it's I discover resonances. I find things in the poems in working on translating that even the writers didn't think consciously about. So it just makes life very rich and fun.
And I know that part of the translation, I feel like it has such a rich literary tradition that doesn't get talked about enough. Another thing we look at in this class is, we look at some Poe, we look at Baudelaire, and we look at the different translations of, one of Baudelaire's to the reader.
Great. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah. And of course, he very famously translated Poe. And then if you look at, a host of translations, like we look at, maybe 20 different translations of Baudelaire, 1 poem, and you can see all these differences. And that's the poem, of course, where he's inventing a word, Trismegistus, kind of taking off this earlier combination of things. And it's very, there's just such a rich literary tradition, and writers, I feel, are so engaged with not just the people who came before them, but also just the cross-cultural, pollination of literature. But yet, it's opened up quite a bit lately, but the Academy historically has had a real, siloing kind of effect in terms of, how to look at these writers and what they're doing.
Although that's something that you're stuck with, and it's hard when you're somebody who's trying to learn. And there's supposedly a fast way to do it is to go to school instead of, school of hard knocks. So when I didn't graduate from, but went to, But that's one of the reasons I stopped going to school, was because I felt university was stopping me from reading. But I'm not counseling that to anybody. It's what I did. What I did 45 or 50 years ago is not something that's advisable today. But you're still dealing with the same thing, like how to read, how to get interested in something else and go and read over there, how to let the beautiful distractions that you are reading enter your being and guide you. Because I always say, people ask me, how do you know how, you're going to translate a book, or what are the, how do you translate, what's your set of rules for translating books? And I always say that the language of the book itself teaches me about the work. It teaches me about itself, and it teaches me how I can translate it. I just have to really be listening.
And this kind of gets into your approach to translation. So we were emailing briefly about this before, but a lot of people consider you a more radical or experimental translator, which I know you don't really see yourself that way.
That's because I've translated almost 30 books, published books. I mostly translate. It's of two factors. One of those is the factor that in Canada, all small presses are subsidized. Publishers that are they're subsidized by one entity, the Canada Council. The Canada Council does not allow publishers to use their subsidy to publish works by foreigners. So even if I translate Chus Pato, the publisher cannot use their grant to publish it. They have to publish an extra book on top of all the other work they're doing. And they work very marginally. They're not driving around Cadillacs, these folks. And that's sometimes beyond their energies. And as well, if they do that, they'll do it with a book of prose that's won a prize somewhere, or something that they think is going to sell. Whereas difficult poetry is not a big seller, even among, poetry. So I have to publish outside the country. I basically have to emigrate in order to do my work. And then if I'm lucky, I can manage to bring the work back so that people can read it in Canada. But as a result of the Canada Council's way of doing things, one of the results is that we don't read much contemporary work in translation unless some Americans have done it or it's been done somewhere else. And so people often don't see my work as a translator. It's not in libraries. It's published by tiny US presses. So it's not in the library. And so they see Sheepsfield Joe by a Fervent Person, which Nancy published, because they thought it would be fun back in the day, and they didn't mind that it didn't get subsidized. And that book, there was a specific trope that I used in translating it, because I realized in reading the original, when I was just learning Galician, and which you can read Portuguese from Galician, that it's a funny book. That what is it called in English now?
Sheep's Vigil by a Fervent Person is your translation, mine, but I'm not sure what
the Keeper of Sheep. Keeper of Flocks, or the Keeper of Sheep. Anyways, it's kind of a book that's funny in the original, and it's not funny in English. And I realized from my own research into the medieval cantigas of scorn and insulting, that humor needs to be explained. It's very time bound, and what was funny once needs to be explained to people in a later era. That's why, like Shakespeare's comedies and his tragedies, when you first start to read Shakespeare, you can't tell the difference. And the funny parts of Shakespeare have to get explained to you in footnotes. The funny parts of the Portuguese Galician medieval cantigas in the Portuguese and Galician books are explained in footnotes, because they can't get, they're remote from what was funny in those times, like making a joke about your fellow poet's coat. It doesn't sound funny anymore because you don't know where it comes from. Why is that funny? So rather than create an edition with a bunch of footnotes telling people this is funny, because I decided that if you moved the book into a contemporary scene, and I could translate it into a contemporary idiom, that it could be funny. And so it's an anachronistic translation. It's out of order of time. But that book has been taught, for over 20 years. And so people think that I I change everything in time, that I change the sex of the narrator all the time, that I do this all the time. And some people have been teaching in universities a thing they call transelation, which is, I called my book a transelation, putting my little E, like E for Erin, into the middle of the word translation to signify joy in doing this, to signify, but it's not. I keep telling people, no, transelation is not a method. Transelation describes this one book. So that's a long explanation, but that's those two things. We're not used to reading poetry in translation, so a lot of my books don't get seen, and in Canada anyway. And when just one book gets seen, then people think, oh, this is what Erin does.
I think there's also something, though, that comes into play where the traditional approach to so that anachronism that you talk about, that isn't a thing that you've invented either, right? Like, this is something that people often invisibly do in translation. Like, there's a tradition historically, we don't do it these days, but for, Western poets translating Japanese poems and changing the birds, right? And doing other sort of anachronistic things to sort of make things more pleasing or more normal, like
more apparent, because otherwise you don't know. Like, if you said the name of a certain flower, that then you would be indicating that the season is fall. But if you're reading it in a place that doesn't have that flower, then you lose the seasonal indication. And if that's the only indicator in the poem, and that's important, then you have to change it.
What I think is so interesting about it is that the traditional, conservative idea of translation is that, there's this thing that it means and you're carrying the meaning over as, closely as possible. But what I find, as
Truce says, nothing means, it functions, or it produces.
Well,
it
precisely.
Produces meaning, but nothing means.
You've got a great line in the prank poem, you or Anna does, I believe it's actually Anna, but in the perfect instant, language is a bridge. And that idea that language is this way of going someplace, as opposed to, it's a thing in itself, but it's also a method of going from place to place. It's not really these destinations. And so I feel like that in some ways encapsulates your approach, which I find personally, although it gets described as radical, to me, it seems like a less radical approach in many respects, because you're trying to actually get the same emotional experience out of the reader that maybe the original poet might have intended.
Which is what
and not so worried about
translators do. And I mean, even there, you're basing yourself on a false assumption, because say if I try to give you the book, like to give so that you are able to have a response in English, say my latest Truce Pato in English, are able to have a response, something like the response of a Galician reader. Well, I can't read her work in the original like a Galician. I can only read it like me. Unfortunately, I spend a lot of time, when it's not COVID, in Galicia, specifically to hear people talk, to hear the way people talk, to hear the way people receive things, to understand what their poetry culture is, to understand the history that's apparent to them. I mean, when you're in a place like Galicia, where your random taxi driver, I mean, I get into a taxi and they laugh at my accent in Galician, because people always talk the colonial language, Spanish anyways, foreigners, they don't speak Galician. So to see a foreigner speaking Galician, they laugh at me. And I say, you shouldn't laugh. And I tell them, like, I'm a translator. And they say, oh, who have you translated? And I say, Rosalia de Castro. And they say, the ride's free. Can I bring you after to meet my mother?
Wow.
I'm like, and they're like, when are you reading? Where are you having coffee? I wanted my mom to meet you, or something like it's and then they're like, oh, just call me next time you need a cab. I'll be out the door and I'll take you where you want to go. I mean, like, this is a taxi driver. It's like, but you translated their national icon in poetry. But nobody here is going to, like, poetry is more remote from people's everyday lives here. And people, like, you look at people from places like Syria, they can recite you tons of poetry in Arabic. Everybody can recite. The plumber comes in my door here and he's like, oh, Erin, and then he gives me a rendition of some poem in Arabic, of some well-known poet. So we have it's hard, like, to translate somebody into your culture and give them a response. There's all kinds of things that you've already can't do, because cultures are different.
What I feel is ironic about it is that you just, in your practice, you will often acknowledge that. Whereas in a more, quote unquote, less radical practice, they'll just glide over it. But really, is it the more like direct approach? Ironically, to me, seems to be your approach of actually, building into the poem the ways in which it falls apart in some respects.
Oh, yeah, sometimes, but sometimes
Not always.
not, but so sometimes you have to. I mean, all translators add something to make here and there to make things comprehensible, or sometimes you have to do an end note. Sometimes you just have to let it go because people are getting other things out of the work, and not everything matters. And actually, I mean, to me, one of the beauties of trying to figure out what is going on, how an original poem is working, is to do what you've done and take like the various translations of a Baudelaire poem and see, like, whoa, where did, you can see more of the Baudelaire poem by reading 6 translations than you can by reading one.
Well, one thing I've just personally, as a writer who doesn't speak any other languages, one thing that your work's really freed me up to do in my practice is to create translations, even though I don't speak any other language. So I'll do precisely that. I won't pretend that they're the best translations, but I'll go read a bunch of different versions and I'll do my own like little translation of a speech from Dante, or line or two from some poet. Just kind of that creative rendering, it becomes sort of a part of a practice of writing. I feel, I don't pretend that they're great translations, but in some cases, I feel they're actually perfectly adequate translations. Where
and they can be, and they're also, they exercise the poetry muscle in your head, in a way that other things don't. If you go on the Modern Poetry and Translation site, MPT, there are often they often hold poetry workshops, which are, well, they call it workshopping a poem, but they'll have a poem in another language that none of us speak, and they'll have somebody do a literal translation of the lines, and then they print both, and then you're invited to submit your translation, and they just put them in as they come in, so that as the workshop goes on, there'll be like 30 versions of the poem. And so then you've got maybe like 25 or 30 lines. Chus Pato did it once. She was the poet once, and I did the literal translation. But I translated a poem from Finnish and a poem from Polish, and I used like Google Translate to try to look at what the original looks like. What words does it's going to do a shitty job, yes, but what words does it evoke for me in my vocabulary? What do I see that I can do, And you can spend some really fruitful hours just frittering away. And as you say, in what you were doing, you end up with a translation. Nobody maybe is going to publish it, except on MPT. They will put it on their website. But you learn, you let language teach you, and you learn a lot, and it's fun.
It's an attentiveness too, as you say. Like, I just feel like you're I feel like people who have more of the approach that you sometimes have, just seem more attentive, and they often will get labeled with that kind of experimental label. Like, you'll often get that experimental label. I feel it's some ways an unfair label. I was talking to the filmmaker Guy Madden once, and he was complaining that people called him an experimental filmmaker, but he was really doing things. He wasn't experimenting, he was really doing it.
But the word in other languages to experiment is to do. Experimentar is to experience and do something,
Yeah, which seems much more ironically in line with how that work tends to operate than maybe how it sounds in English, the connotations in English.
But one time I was in a poetry residency, and a writer who's fairly conservative, who teaches creative writing and poetry fairly conservatively in a fairly conservative town, in a fairly conservative time a long time ago, I did a class visit, and he set me up with somebody who was an informal leader in the class, speaking up to ask me what use I was to them. basically as the writer in residence. And he said this, so this fellow I could tell by the attention of the other people in the class that he was an informal leader, was said to me, well, you're an experimental writer. We're not. How is that how are you going to be able to read our poems and help us? And I said, what kind of poems do you write? And he's like, sonnets. And I says, and when you're writing your sonnet, you mean to tell me you never experiment? And the whole class just went still. And he said, no, I'm going to make an appointment for next week and show you some of my sonnets.
Yeah, it's interesting.
So like everybody experiments, even if you're using some of the most beautiful work done in conventional forms is being the result of crazy experiments, really, And even when it appears to really stick to the form, it takes even more experimenting because you've got no out.
And so often I feel like quote unquote experimental work is really just going a little further along the line of what people are already doing. Like prank, just to come back to the prank, for example, like the joke of that poem in a sequence in many ways is like, here's all these translations and mistranslations, of a poem that maybe didn't even exist. But from poem to poem, from like version to version, everything that happens to the source text is something that does happen in normal translation. It's just pushed a little further. And of course it keeps piling up because of the sequencing of it all.
Yeah. And there's a whole thing too. I mean, it's a bit of vaudeville, really. I mean, in vaudeville, how the pratfall is critical. Like when Charlie Chaplin falls down, he takes a tumble. He doesn't really tumble. It takes a lot of muscles to do that without hurting yourself, though. So, yeah, and to make it look like you've fallen. But so it's kind of like that. It's like there's a conscious effort that goes into trying to make it look like you've fallen.
And it reveals the operations that are normally happening. Like you're kind of extending and revealing operations that are normal and are there, but are often not so apparent. I find that's kind of what poetry does in general. Like it'll take a lot of the literary techniques that we do see in prose, but just make them more obvious. And then when you move into a more experimental, or even just a more comedic space, I find it really useful as a teaching tool because it just sort of displays more self-consciously what's happening. Just kind of to go back to just the kind of craft level, I'm curious to know if you could talk a little bit about sort of how you like to work, either as a poet or a translation later, or where you kind of just sort of how your working day goes, as a writer.
I get up and I work and then I go to bed at night.
Do you have like a particular approach to the process you feel is maybe different from other writers because of your extensive experience in translation, or do you feel like it's just sort of what other writers are doing?
When your hand gets too close to your mouth,
sorry,
you get a crazy violin noise, but no voice.
Sorry, I was just wondering if you felt like you had a process that was in any way maybe different from other writers because of your extensive forays into translation, or do you feel like you're just sort of, working like you're digging a ditch? Like you seem more of a crafts person in many respects than.
What's that? Like, I mean, I work.
Like somebody who has control and an awareness of what they're doing, to me.
Well, I don't know. I don't know. I mean, when I translate, I just, I start by reading the poem in whatever French and I type it in English. And then I have to work from there. I just have to work to think about what it's doing, what's the relationship of the language to the next poem, because I translate books as well, not just single poems. So you can't, the lexicon you use in one poem might be reflected in another part of the book, and you have to make sure you've chosen something that actually works when you get to that next part of the book. So there's a lot of exploration that's not linear in translating a book of poetry. You have to find what you think is the heart. You have to read the book and take notes on things that recur. You have to take notes on how the person is dealing with language structures to break them down or move them, and what effect that has on you as a reader. I mean, to me, I guess I have to ask the questions that I would suggest everybody ask of a poem, rather than, how to interpret it or what does it mean. Nothing means, it functions, or it produces, as Pato says. I look at, like, what is making this tiny little machine work? Where are the pulleys? How are the pulleys organized? Because it takes only this much effort to read this line, and it takes this much effort to read another line. That's pulleys. It's like mechanical kind of engineering things in language that make it work in a certain way or not. And then how is that refracted or reflected later in the book? How do the forms change if they do? And if they don't, why don't they? And what does it mean for the space on the page? So I have to ask all kinds of questions of the book and have those in my mind. Like, taking notes isn't enough. I have those questions as I ask them about the poem or about the book. They change me. When you ask a question in any field, it changes you, who you are. It changes you. So to ask a question and be able to try to listen for the answer from the language itself and from what the poet is doing, you're changing and building a capacity in yourself. And I'm just constantly doing that. Partly because for me, it's not work. I love living in language. It's made my life really rich, like it's amazing.
What do you feel is the importance of the role of humor in your work? Because you really, of course, in the prank sequence, as you say, it's very slapstick. It's got this kind of Three Stooges, Keystone Cops, people running after one another to try to solve something. But also in your other work,
actually in that book.
Mm-hmm. And often in your other work, you'll really prioritize humorous turns, which I find just as a hallmark of a lot of what you do. Now, you can get very sad and move into other spaces, of course. But I'm curious to know what you feel is the sort of role or importance of humor when you use it.
Well, I mean, I always said, like, you have to in this world, you have to laugh to keep from crying. So a lot of my humor isn't. I don't think it's sarcastic, but it's what. It's finding the humor in the disaster. Like, there's always something slightly funny, even when you break your leg, there's something funny about it, So it's to receive the world as being a bit like, taking the Mickey out of you and everybody. And at some points, and you just got to go along with it and laugh. And so, I mean, part of it's that, but it's also like, I mean, I'm a laughing person. So probably some of my personality comes and a jokey kind of a person. There's a kind of humor in Galicia, probably Portugal too, called retranca, which is like, people say things and it sounds serious, and then it hits you that it's like not, but it's not I've seen it translated as sarcasm, but it's not English sarcasm. It's something else. And that retranca is actually the humor that's in Sheep's Vigil. That's that Pessoa employs.
Talk a little bit about Pessoa, particularly in that heteronyms. You've also made use of these heteronyms in your work. Of course, the Sempedrin, who is in that prank sequence, is an important part of that. But I'm curious if you could kind of, I know you get asked this a lot, but and these students haven't quite looked at the Pessoa poem. I often will teach from the Pessoa book, but this time we're looking at prank. But Sempedrin shows up. I'm curious if you could talk just a little bit about Eliza Sempedrin and some of the sort of ways that you've used that heteronym.
Well, I don't know that I think she's kind of, I call her a pantonym, but because she's not like a heteronym in Pessoa, and there's other writers, Iberian writers too, that have used heteronyms. Pessoa is probably the best known from modernism from the 20th century. is that his kind of attitude was be multiple, like the universe. And he created poems and bodies of work by people, but not only that, he created their biographies, their histories, their horoscopes, even what they like to eat. He created a whole person who then wrote differently than another person. So I think that Elisa Sampedrin arose for me in writing Little Theaters years ago. And I wrote Little Theaters right after writing O Citadin, which was a very citational book. It's a kind of book of a mixed genre, philosophy, poetry, fake philosophy, constructed text. And in that book, there was a lot of citations, though, and unfortunately, like, it got shortlisted for a Governor General's Award, and I hadn't asked for permission for any of this. You can cite things a wee bit in a book of poetry or somewhere, but you can't get very far without having to ask for permissions. And I didn't ask for permission, so I was so afraid of having that this light was shone on this book, and I was going to get sued by Derrida or something, and that I got so stressed out about it that in the next book, I said, next book I write no citations. But then I found, like, sometimes the text has a kind of will of its own, and that it wants another voice to comment on something. And that was when that figure arose that was commenting, who became a theater expert. I had to follow her around. She became a theater expert, and I had to read a lot of books to make her into one too. But that's where she first appeared, in this idea that she interferes in other people's books. She doesn't bother to publish books on her own. She just interferes in my work. And so, like, she's back interfering a bit in the current book after having not interfered with her a few books. But she's also, and then Chus Pato wrote a biography for her. So then she had to take on that biography, and she has a personality and stuff that's probably one of my personalities. That's she's cranky, and I'm kind of not, mostly, so that she can be the person who's cranky, and
It's the great the playfulness of having that, as you said, this sort of alter ego who's interfering in your work, in a manner of speaking, is it's so generative and great. I love hearing that Chus Pato has written a biography for Elisa Sampedrin. That's so amazing.
Well, Elisa Sampedrin too. She's like Elisa is like Lise, it's like slippery, smooth, slippery. And Sampedrin comes from San Pedro, who's St. Peter, upon this rock I build my church. But Sampedrin, with that that ending, Sampedrin, it's a very little rock.
Slippery slope.
Sampedrin. Pedrin is like a pebble. So it's a slippery slope of a church built on this very tiny rock. So I enjoyed that about it too. I came up with that name and then did some research to make sure she didn't already, that somebody else didn't have that name already, and nobody
That's wonderful.
did. So,
does anyone have questions they want to hop in and just unmute and ask Erin? Just pause to check in.
If anybody wants to ask something, or I'm perfectly happy to answer you.
I know people can be shy, but I have a question just here.
You can also type your question in the chat.
Yeah,
if you're shy.
That'd be helpful too.
You could type it in the chat and I can just answer it. I have the chat open.
I know that some people are interested in just how it is to co-write with another author. So I know people had emailed me to ask what it was like working with Oana. And
Oana's great to work with. Some people are not great to work with.
How did that prank sequence really kind of start and develop? Like, do you remember the origins of that?
Well, it started in the era when I was writing Ore Splendor, where I was writing Ore Splendor. Well, I wasn't writing that. I was writing things that became Ore Splendor before I was writing Ore Splendor. But I was translating from Romanian, and it's kind of my knowledge of Romanian is also a Romance language. It's derived from Latin, but it's separate from most of the other languages. It shares a bit of a border with Italy or something, and that's about it. But it's because it was kind of separate on the eastern edge of the Roman Empire. It actually absorbed probably about 65% of its lexicon is Slavic, and 35 has Latin roots. And so sometimes there's words that there's two words for one thing, and one has a Latin root and one has a Slavic root, Dacian root. But the structure of the language is structured like Latin. So I was reading the Stănescu because Juana was translating Stănescu properly, and I translated a poem just doing the thing of just looking at the Romanian and seeing what it made me think of, and that was the translation. But I realized I was seeing it through Galician, and so it was actually Elisa Sampedrin doing these translations. And so in O Resplendor, Elisa Sampedrin comes up with ideas about, like, she's like, it's better when you're translating, like, this is Elisa Sampedrin, it's better when you're translating to translate from a language you don't know, because then you can't make any mistakes. So she went through, but it was Juana feeding me Stănescu poems, then curious to see what I would do one at a time. And she was feeding these poems to me one a day at a time when I was not able to write poetry myself. I was in Calgary. My mom was dying. I was just at the hospital every day. And for almost 2 years, she wasn't always in the hospital, but it was but at a certain point, before I would go to bed, I'd go check my email, and Juana would have sent me a Stănescu poem, and I would translate it and then send back the result. And she was saying, like, it still sounds like Stănescu. There's something that you capture in the sound of Stănescu that still sounds like Stănescu, even though it's not the words that he was using in his poem at all. And so we thought a lot about that, about how that you could absorb something of the sound values that contribute to meaning without necessarily knowing exactly what was being said. And so from that, there was some of the things, like I started translating some little bit of Stănescu, and then she decided that if I could translate from Romanian, which I don't know, that she could translate from Galician, which she doesn't know. So we ended up translating back and forth. And then into that poem and into that, remember that poem comes from a whole book too. It's not, this is the prank, really, the whole thing. The book, Expeditions of a Chimera, we were also playing with the whole notion, the Derridian notion of the signature, and of, Derrida says, like, what actually asks in some of his work on the signature, what actually does the signature guarantee? And I'd already worked on, when I was translating or writing these my own versions, having just read the Galician cantigas, I wrote my own poems that are not translations, but using some of the tropes and styles in the poems. And then I signed them. All my poems, the last 2 lines of the poems is the archive number of the poem and the name of troubadour, because I like the names of the troubadours a lot, so I wanted to put them in my poem too. So a lot of people think that is a translation. Those are translations, that book, because they're all signed with the name of a troubadour. But in fact, the name of the troubadour is the last line of the poem. So what makes something a signature? Why is a name a signature? And what does that reveal? And, like, what does it guarantee? And that's especially interesting to somebody named Juana Avasilikoi, everybody's like, and our friend Juana, blah, 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 because few people start to learn how to, say a version of her name. And then my name, which, honest, it's got like 9 letters, 4, then 5. Like, I often don't recognize how it's pronounced or how it's spelt, and so, like, what does this name? And then plus in Galician, my name is Erin Moure. And then in English, it's Erin Moure. And in French, it's Erin Moure. And it's like, so what does this name guarantee exactly? It keeps changing. Does it? All these names guarantee the same person? Like what are we signing up for when we see something as the signature? And so we realized in writing this book too that we could sign each other's names. I could put Juan Avasilikue on my poem because I'm a writer. I can do it. And so we gave ourselves permission, like to do that and to play with those notions. And then we derived immense laughter too from wondering what people would think and who wrote what, Plus, we gave ourselves permission to alter what the other person wrote. Like if I sent her something, she could alter it and then write her own. So she could, we gave each other absolute freedom for the other person to do whatever they wanted to the text.
I love that approach, when you are collaborating and doing that with people, because it's just such a playful, it just, I think, is a reminder of how at the heart of all this language play, there's some play, there's fun and excitement and joy in it. And, even if it is going to move into a darker or sadder space at times, there's this, that movement has a real energy to it.
Mm-hmm. Oh, for sure. And it's lovely. There's these things that are, I don't know. It's lovely. Just those playing with things and playing with sounds. There's this series of, on the things on the street. Like I live near Saint Denis in Montreal, and there's these lit up things that have like a map of where you are, so you can figure out what's around you. And they also sell ads and do things. So there's these ads these days for this radio station. It's probably hard to see on my phone. This is as tall as me, this sign, and it's
wow.
There's a few of them. There's one that goes just do 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 do. And I have an aphasic friend who can't speak, and she communicates by saying do do do. So I'm like, wow. It's like, look,
that's interesting.
She's published on the road.
Just to jump to this prank for 1 second. There's a poem in here, or there's two facing poems on page 42 and 43 of that of the anthology. I can't really read the titles, but the point of them though is it's Coatful, and then the poem that Coatful comes from, and the process here, of course, as you kind of hinted at before, this is a example where the translation, quote unquote, is actually, looking at not trying to replicate the language meaning at all, so much as what do the words look like? What do the words remind you of in terms of their visual look and feel? This word looks like dangles, so I'll use the word dangles in English. So that's a very, extreme translation approach that, is probably the furthest from maybe a quote unquote more normal like translation process. But that's a lot of poets have done that type of translation. B.P. Nichol did a lot of it.
Mm-hmm. For sure.
That it's almost like an I rhyme sort of in concept, but like an I translation. I'm curious to know what you feel those really playful, really kind of language focused quote unquote translation methods that don't really have a lot of interest necessarily in what the thing means, but more of an interest in the surface and the focal, the language focus of it. I'm curious to know what you think about those sorts of more kind of extreme or language or material focused translation approaches.
Well, I wouldn't call, you can get so far that you're not in translation anymore. You're using translational methods for your own practice. And a lot of what people have called translational poetics is basically about appropriation of other people's work, because they do this using other people's work without their permission, so that I can write my own poems. And that's really like, that is driven by the narcissist value of poetry. It can go a certain distance, but if it's not accompanied by actually trying to listen to and welcome the work of others and trying to alter yourself in order to recognize the work of others, instead of altering the work of others to support yourself. If there's not that other direction in the traffic, then, if it's not a two-way street, then pretty soon all the cars are out in a field somewhere. There's nobody downtown. So it's there's that. I mean, in this book prank, or it's called, Expeditions of Accumera, we use translational tools, but we're writing our own work. We're not really translating
But even here, where you're writing your own work, it's all based on this Stănescu poem that doesn't exist. You still are capturing the tone of that Stănescu approach, it seems. So there still is like a somewhat of like a deference to the tone, and there's of course a permission in the sense of like you two are collaborating here and playing around. So I think it's interesting to hear you talk about it that way. I never thought about it, but it makes a lot of sense to kind of consider the motivations and the process as part of the poem and that kind of moral positioning. It's interesting. I'm curious to know if anyone else has like things they want to jump in here before we kind of move towards letting Erin go.
We have about 10 minutes left. So does anybody have, you don't have to, you can ask a question about some other.
Yeah, anything at all, really. That's what kind of chips she likes. What's your favorite type of chips? That's what I want to know.
Erin, can I ask a question?
Mm-hmm.
Sure. At what point in your life did you like branch out from being a girl to being like a strong woman? Sorry, I know it's a convoluted question. I know, like when did you decide that you were a writer that could speak so passionately about everything?
Oh, I don't know.
Did you ever feel suppressed? Like, did you ever feel suppressed in your voice?
No, because I'll get out of it. I'll leave. There was this expression, I don't even know if Baudelaire said this, but somebody once said, and I always have this in my head, Baudelaire said they left two rights out of the rights of, what's that French thing, the rights of man, and they were the first ones to have a kind of rights declaration, the French in their French Revolution. Anyways, and Baudelaire says they left two rights out of it: the right to make a fool of yourself and the right to leave. Mm-hmm. And so I thought, gee, I'm going to take advantage of those two rights: the right to make a fool of yourself, and the right to leave. So I just do. Don't worry about being foolish. I guess I think strength is misinterpreted as being strength when really it's just a willingness to let yourself be foolish in a way, I mean, in a way, I'm still 12 years old. I really haven't got it yet,
But you seem to me, like you seem like how did you break through to that other side? As Moure said.
I don't know. Well, one thing is I realize that I'm no better than other people, and other people no better than me, that other people feel uncertain, and other people can stutter, and other people cannot make sense, and other people can be embarrassed, and also like I tell people, like, I'm actually a shy person. They're like, kidding me. And a friend of mine said, yeah, Attila the Hun was shy too. But I have a hard time to speak up a lot of times. But then too, like, I'm an allergic person. And so the world has always been alien to me because it's not a safe place for me. Yeah. And so I have to say things now because they're, maybe things will just totally screw up tomorrow and I won't be around,
I feel like I hear what you're saying, and I just I want to say the same things. I just want that like extra little thing to jump out like you are jumping out right now. Thank you for all that you do.
Oh, well, thanks. I don't know that I do so much. I do so much because I'm in good company. I always figure I can only do things because I'm in company of others. To me, it's all, I work a corner of, it's like we're all embroidering on a big blanket or something, or quilting a big quilt. And I feel I can do my bit because I feel other people there. I feel the fabric tug as other people are doing their work. And I know I'm just doing my corner. It's all I can do. And, but that we need the corner.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much. That's a great question, Lori, and a great sentiment, I think, Erin, to end off on. It's been really pleasant to have you here in this little community, and thanks so much. And again, just a reminder to people that Erin is the writer in residence here, so for the term, and so you can. I posted in the Nexus site how you can get a hold of Erin and make appointments to talk to her about your work, and if you are a writer yourself or whatever you like.
Yeah, I always say there's some like general framework for getting an appointment, just so people know. But you don't need to. You can bring translations. You can bring other things too. I'm a writer. I've been writing for over 40 years. I've worked as a commercial translator, as a copywriter, as doing all kinds of things. So I mean, I've helped people with many aspects of writing, and you don't have to actually, even if you don't feel like it or you feel shy, you don't have to you can bring me and just show me something that day. You don't have to bring something in advance, and you don't need, if you have more general questions, you don't have to bring writing, is what I'm trying to say. If you just have some kind of questions you want to ask me, you can, and you can come back. Then if you decide, this might be good, then you can come back if you like to. You can make more than one appointment.
And Erin's one of the subset of writers that I often say is the truly professional writer, who actually is really writing and really out there doing it all the time, and not total university subsidized all day, all night. Has really made her own way in this writing world. So I really encourage people to talk to Erin, whatever your ambitions or as a writer might be.
Yeah, I'm happy. I'm always happy to talk to people. That's why I do these residencies. It isn't. It isn't actually because it's I'm desperate to make money or something. It's actually because it gives me a chance to connect with and share some things I've learned with people, and maybe they don't have to go through the same learning curve I went through.
I appreciate it. I just remember even from when I was in school, you were actually one of the, way back in the day at the University of Manitoba, somebody brought you in, I was when you had done Pillage Laud. So you just done that book way back then. And that was the first, time I'd encountered you and your work. I'd even just, encountered that kind of work. And I remember it made a big impression on me, your approach then. And then, of course, when I was in Calgary, around this time you were there, kind of running into you over here and there over the years.
I remember you from Calgary.
Pleasant. Yeah, it's always been encouraging and pleasant. And as a student, like I know, I was always impressed with how receptive you have been to students and really open with them. So I do really encourage, people to get in touch with Erin if they have at all, or tell your friends, if you're not, as interested in writing yourself, let your friends who are know that it isn't just university students that can get a hold of Erin.
Yeah, it's supposed to be for the Winnipeg community, but even if it's somebody, not the whole world, but if I'm not that busy and somebody else from somewhere else wants help. I actually do answer questions when people DM me on Twitter or various places. I don't do people's homework, or I don't answer the question like, what does this poem mean, Erin? I'm like, no, I'm not, I can't hire me to interpret my work. But that you can do it just fine. And I just encourage them about ways of looking at things. But I always, and especially with COVID, when the students were really shut up for a year, I found I was getting more questions from people, so I just really it's one thing I can do. I can try and answer the best I can.
Well, thanks very much, and thanks for joining us.
Okay, thanks everybody. Hope we'll meet some of you later on. Take care.